The house that spoke to its owner. It was a cold November evening in the small town of Ashwood, Ohio. The air carried an unusual stillness, as if nature itself hesitated to breathe. At 7:13 p.m., Jonathan Monroe arrived at his new home after months of searching for the perfect place. He had purchased the charming two-story house on Elm Street just 3 days ago, excited about starting a new chapter in his life. Before we begin, tell me, where are you listening from, and what time is it there? As Jonathan unpacked his belongings, he noticed something peculiar about the house. The wooden floors creaked with a distinct pattern that almost sounded like whispers. Just old house settling, he told himself, with a nervous chuckle. But the feeling persisted. It was as if the house was watching him, studying his every move. At exactly midnight, when the grandfather clock in the living room struck 12, Jonathan heard a faint voice coming from the walls. It wasn't loud enough to be alarming, but clear enough to make his blood run cold. "Welcome home," it said softly, as if the very fabric of the house was speaking to him. His heart raced, and he found himself glancing around the dimly lit room, trying to locate the source of the sound. Pause for dramatic effect. The next morning, Jonathan decided to investigate further. He walked through each room, noticing how the sunlight seemed to avoid certain corners, casting long shadows even at noon. In the basement, he discovered strange markings on the walls, symbols that looked ancient and otherworldly. As he traced one of the symbols with his finger, the temperature dropped suddenly, and he felt a presence behind him. Turning quickly, he saw nothing but the empty space where he had stood moments ago. That night, at precisely 2:47 a.m., the voices returned. This time, they were more insistent, calling out his name in a tone that sent shivers down his spine. "Jonathan?" "Stay," the voice whispered, followed by a low, guttural laugh that echoed through the house. He tried to sleep, pulling the blankets tightly around him, but the sounds continued. Footsteps on the ceiling above his bedroom, doors creaking open and shut despite being securely locked. Over the following days, the phenomena escalated. Objects would move on their own, appearing in different places than where he had left them. A porcelain vase he kept on the dining table would find its way to the kitchen counter every morning, no matter how many times he returned it to its original spot. The mirrors in the house showed reflections that weren't quite right, sometimes showing an extra figure standing behind him when he was alone. One afternoon, while exploring the attic, Jonathan found an old journal hidden beneath some dusty boxes. The entries dated back to the early 1900s and belonged to a previous owner named Henry Caldwell. The writings detailed similar experiences, voices in the walls, moving objects, and an overwhelming sense of being watched. The final entry, written in shaky handwriting, read, "I can't escape it anymore. The house knows me better than I know myself. It speaks to me now, not just in words, but in feelings. I fear what comes next." As the days turned into weeks, Jonathan realized the house was changing him. He began hearing the voices even outside its walls, as if the house had extended its influence beyond its physical boundaries. His dreams became vivid and unsettling, filled with images of faces peering through walls and hands reaching out from shadowy corners. Pause for emphasis. On December 15th, at 3:18 a.m., everything came to a head. The house seemed alive, pulsating with energy that made the lights flicker uncontrollably. The voices grew louder, overlapping each other in a cacophony of whispers and laughter. Jonathan found himself drawn to the living room, where the grandfather clock had stopped ticking. Standing before it, he felt a connection to the house that went beyond mere ownership. It was as if they shared a consciousness. "Who are you?" he asked aloud, his voice trembling. The answer came not from words, but from a deep understanding that filled his mind. The house wasn't just a structure, it was a living entity that had existed long before its physical form. It had absorbed the memories, emotions, and experiences of every person who had ever lived within its walls, creating a collective consciousness that transcended time. In that moment, Jonathan understood why the house had chosen him. It needed someone who could listen, truly listen, to its story. And though the realization brought both terror and wonder, he knew he couldn't leave. The house had become part of him, just as he had become part of it. Their fates were intertwined in ways he could never have imagined when he first stepped through its doors. As dawn broke over Ashwood, Jonathan sat in the living room, staring at the now silent grandfather clock. The voices had quieted, but he could still feel their presence, like a gentle hum beneath the surface of reality. The house continued to speak to him, not through words, but through the subtle movements of its walls, the shifting patterns of its shadows, and the ever-present awareness that he was never truly alone. The witch who tormented a family for years. The witch who tormented a family for years. It was an ordinary evening in the small town of Elmwood, nestled deep within the heart of New England. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, painting the sky with hues of orange and purple. A chill ran through the air as autumn leaves swirled gently around the old oak tree standing tall at the corner of Maple Street. This was where it all began, a tale that would haunt the memories of one family forever. Mrs. Eleanor Carter, a kind-hearted woman in her late 40s, lived with her husband Robert and their two children, Emily and Thomas, in a modest home on Maple Street. Their house stood quietly among others, its white picket fence framing a garden filled with blooming flowers during warmer months. But this particular night felt different. There was an eerie stillness in the air, as though nature itself held its breath. Eleanor noticed it first when she heard faint whispers coming from the attic. At first, she thought it might be the wind playing tricks on her ears, or perhaps the old pipes groaning under pressure. She dismissed it and continued preparing dinner for her family. However, as the hours passed, the whispers grew louder, almost rhythmic, like someone chanting softly but deliberately. Robert, who had been reading the newspaper by the fireplace, looked up sharply when he too heard the sound. "Did you hear that?" he asked, his voice tinged with curiosity, yet laced with unease. "Hear what?" Emily replied innocently, her young face lighting up as she played with her dolls nearby. Robert shook his head. "Nothing, sweetheart," he said, forcing a smile to reassure her. Yet, deep down, he couldn't shake off the feeling that something wasn't right. That night, sleep eluded them all. Each member of the Carter family lay awake in their beds, listening intently to the strange noises emanating from the attic. It wasn't just whispers anymore. There were tapping sounds, soft but insistent, followed by low growls that sent shivers down their spines. The atmosphere inside the house became oppressive, heavy with tension and fear. The next morning brought no relief. As Eleanor went about her daily chores, she found peculiar things happening around the house. Items were misplaced, her favorite teacup sitting atop the refrigerator, books stacked neatly in places they hadn't been before, and even the salt shaker positioned upside down on the dining table. None of these occurrences seemed accidental. They carried an air of deliberate mischief. Thomas, only 8 years old at the time, came running into the kitchen, panic evident in his wide eyes. "Mom! Mom!" he cried out, clutching a toy car tightly in his hand. "There's a shadow in my room. It moves when I'm not looking." Eleanor bent down to comfort him, her own heart pounding wildly in her chest. "It's okay, honey," she murmured soothingly. "Sometimes our minds play tricks on us." But deep down, she knew better. As days turned into weeks, the disturbances escalated. Candles flickered without cause, doors slammed shut violently despite calm weather, and cold spots appeared randomly throughout the house. One evening, while Robert was working late at his office, Eleanor decided to investigate the source of the haunting herself. Armed with nothing more than a flashlight, she ascended the creaky wooden stairs leading to the attic. The moment she stepped inside, a wave of dread washed over her. The air was thick, suffocating almost, carrying a faint smell of sulfur. Shadows danced erratically across the walls, taking shapes that defied logic. Then, amidst the chaos, she saw a Heron old woman cloaked in black, her face obscured by a wide-brimmed hat. Her presence radiated malevolence, striking terror into Eleanor's very soul. "Who are you?" Eleanor demanded, her voice trembling despite her best efforts to sound brave. The figure, laughed a chilling, guttural sound that echoed through the cramped space. "I am the guardian of this place." The woman hissed, her words dripping with venom. "And your family has trespassed upon my domain." Eleanor stumbled backward, nearly dropping her flashlight. Before she could gather her wits, the woman raised a gnarled hand, muttering words in a language unfamiliar, yet unsettlingly ancient. A surge of energy coursed through the room, forcing Eleanor to flee back downstairs. When Robert returned home that night, he found Eleanor pale and shaken, recounting the horrifying encounter. Together, they sought answers, consulting local historians and folklore experts. What they discovered chilled them to the bone. Decades earlier, a witch named Agatha Blackwell had resided in their very neighborhood. Accused of practicing dark magic, she had vanished mysteriously after being ostracized by the community. Some claimed she had cursed those who dared trespass onto her land, binding her spirit to the area long after her physical form had perished. Determined to break the curse, the Carters reached out to a renowned paranormal investigator named Henry Grayson. Known for his expertise in dealing with supernatural phenomena, Grayson